Hello, welcome to News with Rupert. I'm your host, Rupert Common.
Arise, my Green Ranger!
Today we are focusing on a national crisis which has been unraveling on social media for some time. It's been in the local news, the national news, and now has global headlines. I'm referring to the conflict between Indigenous and commercial lobster fishermen in Nova Scotia. Now, this story has been widely reported on, from CBC to the Globe and Mail. It's everywhere. But it was an Indigenous independent journalist named Maureen Gugu, a Mikmaq woman who grew up in the Sepeknegitik First Nation of Edinburgh, at the epicenter of where these events take place, that has been reporting on the situation for months. Can we get an air horn for Maureen, please? Thank you. You can help support Maureen and other Indigenous journalists by going to kukukwis.com and clicking the Patreon link, or follow at MGOOGOO on Instagram. Without our information, I could never have made this super high-tech timeline. Highlight some of the major events in order to comprehend the scope of the story and to see how the conflict has escalated to this crisis point. So let's begin with the news that caught the world's attention. On Saturday, October 17th, 12 a.m., a fire breaks out at a lobster pound in Pubnico. It decimates the building, requires almost 100 firefighters to put it out. One person sustains life-threatening injuries. They may or may not be involved in arson. The RCMP called this fire suspicious, which doesn't seem like the most appropriate word given this case. 3 days before, on October 13th, the same lobster pound was surrounded by several hundred white lobster fishermen, hell-bent on taking back lobsters caught by two Mikmaq fishermen who were barricaded inside, fearing for their lives. Yes, I said white. I didn't say non-Indigenous. I'm really not seeing any brown people in the footage of the mob or in any of the photos on the news. So for any non-white people in the mob, I'm sorry if you feel left out. On the same night, 110 kilometers away, another mob repeated similar behavior in New Edinburgh, where they set a van on fire, destroyed lobster supplies, and damaged the facility. Here's some footage caught from the smartphone cameras that night.
Sounds like you're siding with the Mikmaq. Don't you know they're depleting our resources?
No, they're not. They're only trying to make a moderate livelihood.
This isn't fishing season! These Indigenous boats are a threat to our lobster stocks!
Burn 'em!
Chief Mike Sachs of the Sepeknegitik First Nation stated publicly that these were hate crimes and asked for prayers to be sent to his community. He also repeatedly asked for actual physical support, as this violent incident comes after weeks of increasing conflict. See, the fire that burned down the lobster pound on the 17th isn't the first suspected case of arson that's happened in the community. On October 5th, Robert Sillyboy, pictured here, may I add, that is a handsome man, just in my opinion. Anyways, he got his boat mysteriously burned down. You see, Robert, like many Mikmaq fishermen, conduct their rights to fish outside the mandated Canadian fishing season. They are protected under the Peace and Friendship Treaty signed between several First Nations and the Crown in 1760 and 1761. Notice here on the timeline, it's the oldest point of interest. Zoom ahead to 1999, we have the historical Supreme Court case R v. Marshall. This reaffirmed the Friendship Treaty and is the basis for Mikmaq fishing behaviors. Basically, a Mikmaq fisherman, John Marshall Jr., got dinged by the state for selling eels caught out of season with an illegal net. He didn't have a license. But then they realized that he was protected under this treaty, and they reversed the decision, and it's this landmark case, which is now on its 21st anniversary, and is actually in the consciousness of that community. The Mikmaq have a right to make a moderate livelihood off of their fishing. The term moderate livelihood is perhaps the most important aspect of the whole story, as the inability for governing bodies to agree upon this definition has dragged on for 21 years and is the root of the frustration and violence. Because of this excruciatingly bureaucratic process, the Mikmaq took matters into their own hands, and on September 17th, a month before the fire, they proudly launched an Indigenous-owned, rights-based fishing company with its own fleet. This momentous event occurred in Saulniéville, Nova Scotia, with a ceremony to bless the fleet and distribute the licenses. Several days later, over the weekend of September 20th, incidents went down in St. Mary's Bay, where mainly white fishermen aggressively confronted the fleet of 7 to 10 boats. Here's some footage from that day.
Oh, I'm feeling great about this moderate livelihood fishery. Proud to be a part of this. Wait a minute. Picking up a disturbance from the DFO's channel.
What is it?
The whites.
Videos of dangerous boating were circulated on Instagram, high-speed maneuvers, bullying of Indigenous boats. Non-Indigenous vessels even shot flares at the Mikmaq fleet. The opposing flotilla occurred under the watch of, get this, the RCMP, Coast Guard, and some helicopters. Following the events, Sepekneganik Chief Robert Sack, who has been nothing but composed and honorable throughout all media interactions, issued a public announcement calling once again for support from the federal government. He had previously written a letter on September 14th addressed to the Federal Fisheries Minister Bernadette Jordan, RCMP Commanding Officer in Nova Scotia Lee Bergerman, and Premier Stephen McNeil, outlining the escalating transgressions being committed against his people. In the letter, he mentions sabotaged equipment, burned boats, racial discrimination from businesses, and Oceans Canada seizing their gear. Hundreds of commercial fishermen even targeted the homes of people who bought Indigenous caught fish to deter them from buying more. A few days after the letter that was written on the 14th, the Nova Scotia Assembly of Mikmaq chiefs decreed this situation a state of emergency. When we see how many times Chief Sack has asked for help, it's astounding that he did not receive the support. And this is perhaps why the RCMP and the federal government is receiving the brunt of the criticism. Amidst all the chaos, Nova Scotia Premier, leader of the region, simply sidestepped the whole situation, said it was Justin Trudeau's responsibility, not his. Now, maybe this is true, but it kind of reminds me of like a dad like offloading decisions to his wife, like, I don't know, ask your mother. And what about JT? Well, throughout this whole time, it appeared Trudeau was content not to make moves of any kind to support the Mikmaq. But after the mob surrounded the 2 lobster pounds, he did have this comment to say.
I understand the concerns and the conflict going on right now, but we need to find a solution.
Wow, that's it? Justin, you realize like that's you. You're the guy who can do something about it. According to Mikmaq fisherman Jason Marr, who is one of the people trapped inside the lobster pounds in Pubnico, it took the RCMP 2 hours to respond to his call of distress. When they got there, they witnessed acts of vandalism, intimidation, damage to property, theft. They made no arrests. The only thing they actually did do was help relay messages from the mob to the trapped Mikmaq fishermen. They're like, hey boys, so the mob wants you to give up your catch and then you can leave the area if that's cool with you. Meanwhile, rocks are being thrown, the building's being ransacked, fresh bait is being destroyed by toxic chemicals, lobster catches are being strewn on the ground and rendered worthless. Marr watched his personal vehicle have the window smashed, some kind of toxic chemical poured down the vents, I think antifreeze was put in the gas tank, and one man urinated on the driver's seat. To the very special human being who urinated on that seat, you know who you are. And I hereby summon all potential pagan Celtic powers from my ancient ancestors to set a curse on your dinner table, that any lobster you shall tasteth will from here on have the effect of urine to your taste buds, until the day you apologize for your immature actions, good sir. Jason Marr was in the lobster pound that night because he feared an attack was on the horizon. He had been warned by a friend that these fishermen were going to burn down his boats, and it's a threat that he probably took seriously considering it already happened to his friend, as we mentioned earlier, Robert Silly Boy, who's the handsome, well-dressed guy with the cool hat. Shout-outs to you for being pretty fresh. The mob also justified their actions, stating they found egg-bearing females and frozen lobsters stored, which is like some kind of evidence of bad fishing practices. But Chief Sack has since quashed those allegations, stating they weren't owned by Indigenous lobster fishermen and that freezing dead lobsters is actually a common practice amongst commercial fisheries. And all of this in the name of conservation? How are you conserving lobster by destroying thousands of pounds of already caught lobster? At one of the sites, they even cut off oxygen to the tanks and almost killed fresh lobster. This is another video from that day.
Ariel! All the white people, them a burn up all the Indigenous people, boy!
Sebastian, what are you talking about? That sounds like so un-Canadian.
No, girl, it's true! Them a poison the bait, them a toss out all the lobster! Me staying down here.
Now this conservation argument is pretty flimsy when it's actually put under some professional scrutiny. 5 different professionals were interviewed in the Hakai magazine of Coastal Science and Societies, and they do not confirm that this argument is accurate. Bob Stanek, a lobster botanist from University of Maine, stated that despite 150 years of targeted fishing, lobster populations are doing quite well. Susanna Fuller, the vice president of Nova Scotia-based NGO Oceans North, commented that the 10-boat fleet of the Sepekneganik with their 500 or so traps compared to the 900,000 traps in the rest of Atlantic Canada would make a minimal impact, and declared the two main issues were racism and the government's need to define a moderate livelihood on a community basis. Megan Bailey, a fisheries scientist at Dalhousie University, made the point that the entire system must be looked at and questioned for its sustainability, not just one fishery. She added to her point, saying that female lobsters bear eggs throughout an 11-month period, not just in summer. Either way, you have to regulate the catches, which Indigenous fishermen do. I mean, who better than Indigenous people to practice environmental conservation? They kind of invented it. You know, out of the last 2 months, one of the themes arising is the lack of RCMP action or the proper federal support. In the case of the mob behavior, we really see a double standard that is present in Canada, with how RCMP treat Indigenous people compared to white people. Look no further than the siege of Kanawake, aka the Oka crisis, Gustafson Lake standoff, or the Wet'suwet'en crisis to see how federal troops are disbanded when Indigenous people mobilize in any kind of resistance. Remember that video of the Athabasca Chippewayan First Nation chief Alan Adam, where he got tackled by a white policeman in a parking lot? It was a straight up rugby tackle with a running start, and he was already restrained by the guy's partner. With this in mind, how do these white fishermen get treated when they're committing actual violent acts and dangerous crimes? They're left to their own devices. They're not harmed in any way. No spear tackles, no pepper spray, no guns pulled, no calls for backup, and certainly no federal troops coming in for a siege. When questioned about the RCMP's lack of action, this is what Sergeant Andrew Joyce had to say.
Taking the information and the evidence into account to make
Cat got your tongue there, Sarge? The same guy in a CBC article is quoted as saying, "We live in a country so great that people can criticize the police for their actions or what they appear to see as inactions." Man, wake up. The RCMP has an issue with systemic racism just like every other institution in this country. Bill Blair, Canada's Minister for Public Safety, also defended the RCMP's actions. He states that his people are keeping the peace, doing their best, and working as quickly as possible. Instead of saying they made mistakes, he actually credits them for gathering intelligence and which have led to charges against the vandals. But he never admits them doing any wrong in any way. Like, surely you can see some flaws, Bill. And I think this is where we need to check ourselves. Just because you're the leader of a team or an institution doesn't mean you can't admit when something goes wrong. I can sympathize with the hardworking fishermen of Acadia. They do dangerous work, and they do work that benefits everyone in the nation, and they bring income to themselves and to our economy. But you can't really defend these actions that these mobs have taken. We really don't know what's going to happen next. All the nation can do is watch as the events unfold. The RCMP are there in higher numbers. The NDP have called their emergency debate. There's still no federal troops. And at this point, there's been no retaliation from the First Nations community. In fact, throughout these 2 months of vandalism, aggression, intimidation, threats, arson, and violence, they've remained passive. Looks like that in this situation, the real peacekeepers are the Mikmaq. This has been News with Rupert. We'll see you next time.
It's morphin' time!